everyone. I'm certainly delighted to be here today and to talk about my fellowship that I've spent many months working on, and certainly an interest for me. So I'll get started. Just send a note through the chat box if you're having trouble hearing me. Otherwise, I'll continue. Okay, so I'm hoping that today's session that you'll hear a bit more about my fellowship, learn more about how I use the Knowledge to Action framework to plan and organize my project as it relates to the NCAST parent-child interaction scales, gain some insights as to the value of partnerships and collaborating with other similar community health organizations like other Healthy Babies, Healthy Children programs, identify barriers and facilitators from nurses using the NCAST PCI Scales with their at-risk families, and understand overall how this, by improving implementation of these scales in practice, how we can hopefully improve and strengthen nursing practice and improve parent-infant interactions with our families. Just checking in, can everyone hear? I'm seeing some notes in the box, in the chat box. Okay. So this is the Grey Bruce Health Unit. This is, we serve a population of about 162,000 people across 2 counties, Grey and Bruce, and 17 municipalities. In our area that we serve is about 8,500 square kilometers, and our building you see here is just located on the southern shore of Georgian Bay in a valley just below the cliffs of the Niagara Escarpment at the foot of the Bruce Peninsula. So if you ever get a chance to travel this way, it's a beautiful, beautiful area. So I want to just jump right into what is a fellowship. So it was an opportunity, or it is an opportunity rather, for nurses to create an experience designed to meet your own learning needs. It's an opportunity to mentor with other nurse colleagues and organizations, and it is an opportunity for your organization to improve patient or client care. So when we were designated a best practice spotlight organization through the RNAO in 2015, we've had 3 fellowships since then, and hopefully more moving forward. Okay, so I just wanted to jump into my fellowship here. So you'll see on the left-hand side a team, and I want to really emphasize that this fellowship isn't done in isolation. It's 450 hours of learning and exploring, but it's not done in isolation. I certainly had a team behind me and with me along the way, and you'll see, you might recognize some names here, and some are within my own organization. Nancy Del Mastro was my first master trainer when I first learned, became reliable using these tools, and she was from Middlesex London Health Unit. Bernie was certainly a helpful resource throughout my fellowship. She is at Niagara Health Unit, and she was seconded to the Ministry of Children and Youth Services to help support the implementation of these scales across the health units. And May Tao, who is a health promotion specialist and project coordinator for the RNAO BPSO initiative at Toronto Public Health. And so I just want to thank them before we get started. Sorry, I jumped ahead there. So I had to develop with my team some short-term and long-term objectives of what my fellowship was going to do, and hopefully where I wanted to end up. And I just this is pretty superficial, but I wanted to explore what the barriers and facilitators were of the NCAST PCI scale implementation, with the hope that at some point, by identifying barriers, that we could then work towards addressing the barriers, in increasing facilitators, and hopefully from there would improve implementation with public health nurses to use these scales with their families consistently and routinely, that ultimately would end up strengthening nursing practice in general and the Healthy Babies program across the province. And by using these scales with our families as they're intended, we can improve parent-child interactions, which ultimately is the foundation, one pillar in the foundation of early child development. And so that's what I was going with. Okay. So for those who are not, I'm not sure who's in the audience, so maybe we should start with a poll. If you could tell me, you'll see the poll questions there, what sector do you work in? Are you public health? And then if so, are you in Healthy Babies or not? So just take a minute there and submit when you're ready. Okay, so I'll carry on. When we say NCAST parent-child interaction scales, you'll notice throughout my presentation, I may refer to them as the acronym just for to make it quicker. And so NCAST, I should highlight, really is Nursing Child Assessment Satellite Training, which is a self-sustaining organization at the University of Washington School of Nursing. And so what these tools are, for those that are in the audience that aren't familiar with parent-child interaction scales, there are two. There's the feeding scale and the teaching scale. And so the teaching scale, for example, can be used for newborn zero, or used with newborns rather, till 36 months. It's a relatively brief assessment of the parent-child interaction. They can be used on a routine basis in clinics or home visit. And for the high-risk parent-child dyad, it provides a means for monitoring how the dyad is functioning, and does so in the context where we as public health nurses can give anticipatory guidance, and it can be quickly framed in daily activities such as play when teaching the child new skills. That both teaching and the feeding scales are reliable and valid means of observing and rating the caregiver-child interaction for the purposes of assessing whether the dyad has problems in their interaction and communication pattern. Okay. So it looks like most are from public health and in the Healthy Babies program. Okay, thank you. Okay. I must say that there has been some work on different tools to measure the interaction with between parents and children, and there's certainly value in understanding and identifying how certain caregiver-child interaction characteristics can put children at risk for significant challenges later. And so the caregiver-child interaction and attachment should be assessed early in the child's development when interventions for improving their relationship can be implemented most effectively. So what you see here is the child assessment model, and to give you some understanding about what the tools measure that aligns well with the goal of the HBHC program. So this is a framework for child health assessment, and you'll see the three overlapping circles. So the smallest circle represents the child and important personal characteristics such as physical appearance, temperament, feeding and sleeping patterns, and self-regulation. The next largest circle represents the caregiver, which includes the psychosocial assets, physical and mental health, life changes, expectations, and concerns about the child, as well as their caregiver's caregiving style and adaptation skills. And then the largest circle represents the environment for both the child and the caregiver, and that includes the social and financial resources. But the most important piece in this framework is the overlap, the intersection between the three circles, and that's the darkest area, the blackened area. So that represents the interaction between the child, caregiver, and the environment. Okay. So what does parent-child interactions have to do with early child development? And I'm going this way because as part of one of my objectives, I really wanted to ensure that there was some understanding that it really is linked, and this is something I explored a lot more in my fellowship too, along with exploring the barriers and facilitators of using these skills. So, I think, Andrea, if you wanted to start that video, it's just a short video about the interaction between parent-child.
The key to forming strong brain architecture is what's known as serve and return interaction with adults. In this developmental game, new neural connections form in the brain as young children instinctively serve through babbling, facial expressions, and gestures. And adults return the serve, responding in a very directed, meaningful way. It starts very early in life, when a baby coos and the adult interacts and directs the baby's attention to a face or hand. This interaction forms the foundation of brain architecture upon which all future development will be built. It helps create neural connections between all the different areas of the brain, building the emotional and cognitive skills children need in life. For example, here's how it works for literacy and language skills. When the baby sees an object, the adult says its name. This makes connections in the baby's brain between particular sounds and their corresponding objects. Later, adults show young children that those objects and sounds can also be represented by marks on a page. With continued support from adults, children then learn how to decipher writing and eventually to write themselves. Each stage builds on what came before. Ensuring that children have adult caregivers who consistently engage in serve and return interaction, beginning in infancy, builds a foundation in the brain for all the learning, behavior, and health that follow.
Thank you. Okay, so for many of you in the audience today, the Barnard model is not new, but for those who aren't familiar with it, I'll just give you a brief overview. So Dr. Catherine Barnard, professor of the family and child nursing at University of Washington, started research that brought the ecology of early child development closer to clinical practice because she developed methods for assessing behaviors of children and parents. She identified environmental factors that are critical to a child's well-being and demonstrated the importance of parent-child interaction as a predictor of later cognitive and language development. So the model you see here shows how both partners contribute to an interaction to enable it to occur and continue. So the arrows moving from the caregiver to the infant and the infant to the caregiver show the adaptation. When adaptation occurs, it's seen as a smooth and positive interaction that is mutual. The break in the arrow represents interference and interruption in the adaptive process and causes the interactive system to break down. And in both boxes, those are the responsibilities of each. So you'll see the infant and child certainly has responsibilities in an interaction, and as does the parent. And this really, you'll see these are form into the subscales of the two feeding and teaching scales, parent-child interaction scales. And this is what, when public health nurses become reliable to use these scales with their families, they're looking at each of these areas: sensitivity to cues, the parent's ability to alleviate stress, and also provide growth fostering situations. And then also observing the infant-child characteristics. How clear is that child or infant giving cues, and how responsive are they to the caregiver? So that's just hopefully an overview of the scales and the science behind it. So what you see here is the knowledge to action framework that was developed in Canada by Graham and colleagues, following a review of 31 planned action theories. So in the center of this framework, you'll see the upside down triangle, and that is the knowledge creation component. And so that in itself, I think of in terms of this fellowship, the parent-child interaction scale. So I didn't question their valid and reliable means of assessing parent-child interaction. The quality of the evidence never came into question for me because it's well cited in the literature that these tools are likely the best tools to use aside from other ones that are out there. So this framework certainly provided a way for me to plan and organize my fellowship and work through my own barriers of the fellowship, and hopefully moving forward into the future will be useful. So when we come out of that center part, the knowledge creation funnel, and we go around clockwise, that's the action cycle. And so it's an opportunity, it's a way to work around the circle. They're the activities and processes related to the use or application of knowledge. And you can use this framework at any stage, so you don't necessarily have to come in start from the beginning at the knowledge creation part. You can certainly just apply it when you're looking at something that's already been created and you're hoping to translate knowledge to practice. Okay, so as you'll see here, assessing barriers to knowledge use was ultimately the focus of my fellowship. And identifying the barriers and facilitators to knowledge use are among the most crucial steps in this knowledge to action process. And you'll see shortly we'll get into commonly cited barriers and facilitators to using evidence in practice or research in practice. Okay, and then part of my fellowship, when I was assessing for barriers and facilitators, I also asked the participants what their ideas were to addressing the barriers, what they thought would help them use these scales better or more often in practice as they're intended. And so that is where the arrow comes in, and I used their feedback to help support some recommendations I put forward. And we'll get into that later. So one of the first objectives of my fellowship, I wanted to look at the literature to find out more about what existed in terms of NCAST, parent-child interaction scales, implementation in nursing practice, if there was any literature that existed on that topic. And I quickly found that I wasn't able to find very much that was that specific to NCAST implementation. You'll find in the literature that there is a significant amount of literature that uses these parent-child interaction scales that really speaks to the importance and how good these scales are at assessing the parent-child interaction and identifying areas of strength and also problem areas, but not in terms of implementation in nursing practice. So I had to modify my research questions to really look broader. So what barriers existed to using evidence in public health nursing practice, again, looking at the facilitators to using evidence in our practice. And I was able to spend some time looking at the whole idea of knowledge translation strategies and what were most effective in the literature. So I just wanted to have our next poll. Andrea, so has anyone in the audience been able to use a framework or model when planning or evaluating a practice change project? I'm interested to know that. For me, this was my first go at it, and I found it helpful, but this is also something I'm interested in finding out. And if you did, I'd be interested to hear what framework or model you used. Certainly, there's lots out there, and depending on your setting, you know, some can be a good fit, and others not so good.
So if you did use a framework or a model, if you wanted to just type that into the chat box, and we'll see it there. And make sure to choose all participants.
Thanks. Okay. Okay, I'll carry on. So as I'm waiting to see the responses, I'll carry on and check back in. So just a quick overview, and then I'll get right into what I found out about barriers and facilitators across Healthy Babies programs. Okay, most it looks like hasn't used a framework, and that's okay. Okay. So essentially, barriers and facilitators to knowledge in changing practice, I found that it was complex, that it's multi-layered, that barriers and facilitators can exist at the same time and be the same, existing at the same time. And it's very fluid too. There's constant change in healthcare, and so I found it to be important to assess and reassess periodically for barriers and facilitators because they can change with changes within an organization, a program, or a broader even. So, and context is very important too. So my report that I'll share at the end, or offer to share at the end, will go into more detail about that, but essentially it is very multi-layered. It certainly looking at the literature to find out what was most commonly cited really helped with my next step, and I'll get right into my environmental scan. Certainly I wasn't surprised at what I found out with the environmental scan. So the second objective of the scan, I wanted to look at how NCAST scales had been implemented across a sample of Ontario health units who also deliver the Healthy Babies program. Although the Healthy Babies program is a mandatory program and the protocol provides boards of health with the information they need to support the delivery of the program, there is still variation in some variation in how the program is delivered across the province. And certainly, you know, there's lots of variation in sizes in health units that leads to differences in the program as well. So I sought to explore the perceptions of master trainers of the barriers and facilitators that impact the use of the scales by public health nurses they work with. And so the scan, it seemed to be a convenient sample because I was early on invited to participate in the NCAST master trainers. And the master trainers are the ones that at their health units train the nurses to become reliable to use the scales. And so that community of practice monthly teleconference really proved to be helpful and a really good resource to me. So using the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care's initial report on public health, I was able to try to get a good cross-section, a good representation of health units, but not all health units the same. I wanted to see really how were NCAST skills being implemented within their program, and really, was anyone hitting the mark? So was anyone, any programs, any health units really using the scales, both scales, as they're intended with their families? And they're meant to be used not once per family. They're meant to be used over time with families more than once to monitor growth, much like growth and development screens you do with children. A good screen doesn't mean you stop, you continue, because development can change over time. And then if there wasn't any health units hitting the mark, I wanted to find out, well, what made them different? What factors helped implementation of these scales in their practice? So I was able to interview 8 other health unit master trainers that represented a mixture of best practice spotlight organizations, various health units with various governance structures, so autonomous, semi-autonomous, and regional. Some health unit master trainers worked mainly rural, others were urban-rural mix, and then there was a range with population, some less than 80,000 to more than 1 million. So part of the report that I'm happy to send you after, there is an appendix with the moderator guide with the questions that I asked, and you're more than happy to have a look at those questions. So I'm just going to go into the slides that highlight the quotes that really led to the identification of a theme. Okay, so I'm not going to read these quotes. I'm going to talk about what the theme represented, and I may point out some key quotes that I thought was really interesting. So, with the environmental scan, the top most commonly cited barrier was a problem around training and role clarity. So you'll see those quotes. So the training to become certified to use the scales was identified as the most common barrier, and likely contributes to a nurse's level of confidence and perceived usefulness in using the scales in practice. The intensity of the training was described as scary, intense, and overwhelming, and difficult for many PHNs, and PHNs for public health nurses. It was also mentioned that the training is very prescribed and very little room to change it. However, some master trainers had created additional learning opportunities for their nurses leading up to the annual training refresher. In addition to the perception of the training as it related to being certified, connecting the assessment results to interventions in practice was also identified as problematic. So when you use the scale, you observe a parent, an infant, and there are areas identified as having problems, then there are interventions. And so many were still not using the parents as partners education parenting curriculum, which is one of the recommended intervention programs with these scales. And then others were not sure how to really apply the interventions for each of the subscales within the assessment tool. I should point out at this point that overall there was a consensus that the barriers to using the scales in nursing practice have decreased since the beginning, since 2011 when the training first began. And so I think that's a really positive thing, and that may be more of a natural process than anything. You'll see I've kind of added a facilitator in that's really linked to the training and role clarity. So some had in the environmental scan had already started troubleshooting around trying to make the training less scary, trying to review the scales, each subscale within the scale, you know, leading up to the annual refresher training, and that seemed to be positive. They seemed to get positive feedback from the nurses. Okay. The next commonly cited barrier was incorporating the use of the scales in high-risk home settings. So families in the Healthy Babies program are described as complex with complex situations, which can affect the nurse's ability to carry out any previously made plans for the home visit. Using the scales in the program was described by master trainers as challenging at times for reasons such as crises in the family, the client refusing the assessment, attachment wasn't identified as a top priority or as a priority by the family, and different cultures and languages can make it more challenging to use the scales with the families. Crises in the family at the time often takes priority in the home visit and takes over the nurse's plans to use the scales. For example, like threats of eviction or homelessness. It's certainly trust between the nurse and the client is important. As well, the timing of the visit isn't always ideal when you're wanting to observe a feeding. You need to be there when the baby is showing signs of hunger and is ready for a feed, and that can be challenging to schedule those visits around the feeding times. And language is a barrier, or has been a barrier for some. There was a mix of responses that indicated that nurses don't use the scales with these families, while others said even though they question the reliability of the results, there's still value in doing them because the nurse can still provide positive, empowering feedback to the parent. And so I think that's important to remember, that although there's these barriers, it doesn't mean it's not possible. It just means there's still value in providing positive, strength-based feedback to any parent, no matter what that is. Other situations where it proved to be more difficult to use the scales in the home setting was if an infant remains in intensive care for 2 to 4 months, or if the child or infant is in a foster home and the parent has very limited access to the child. Okay. Okay, workload and time. Time and workload were cited as barriers to using the scales in the program. The master trainers felt that the time to complete the assessment or interpret the results and provide recommendations was cumbersome and often interfered with the amount of times the nurses could devote to the process. In addition to the concern about the time needed to complete one scale, concern was also noted about meeting expectations around the recommended timings of the feeding and teaching scales to be done with families. And it was interesting too because it was brought out that in terms of client-based programs, and Healthy Babies is one, when there's, you know, whether it's implementing a best practice guideline or trying things out that requires a client-focused program, Healthy Babies often is defaulted. It often defaults the work to the Healthy Babies program, so that adds to the workload. So while NCAST is one thing, that's a foundation in the program, sometimes nurses are also doing other things like NRT, nicotine replacement therapy with clients, or implementing other best practice guidelines. So that all together influences their perception and ability to devote time to other things. Okay. So nurses who were using the scales had more confidence in using the scales, and so that may or may not be surprising to some of you, although it can, confidence can be a barrier to using the scale. It's like a chicken or the egg. So if we can use the scales more, we can increase our confidence, and then that can motivate us to continue using the scales. Okay. Catching up here. So there were other mentions that there wasn't enough to really pull a theme together, but it is in my report, and you're more than welcome to see that. But I wanted to make a point because it certainly wasn't surprising. It came out again, organizational support. The organization plays an important role in any evidence-informed practice or implementation of knowledge into practice, and it was the case identified as a barrier and a facilitator in the scan for different health units. There was mixed results when it came to the management support of NCAST scales in nursing practice. Some health units still had not developed a policy or protocol to support the implementation of the scales into the program, and not embedded it into any organizational program practices such as regular case reviews, reflective practices, or standing agenda items on regular Healthy Baby program meetings. So most health units in the scan had reported having NCAST PCI scales embedded into existing organizational practices, and even had a few management even some health units even had management participate in the training to be certified in order to role model and better understand the discussions with staff in regular case reviews. So there was a mix of organizational support. Not having an in-house NCAST master trainer was seen as a barrier, and having a master trainer in-house was a facilitator. The baby-friendly initiative, which health units, it's an indicator, accountability indicator. There was, at least at one point, some conflicts between the NCAST tools and resources and the baby-friendly initiative, but from my understanding, that has been dealt with, and pictures that aren't allowed have been removed or changed. So that, again, is some change over time. So the next objective, and I'll go through, I was able to facilitate a focus group with my own colleagues here at the Grey Bruce Health Unit. We have a smaller program team of public health nurses than other health units, so I had about 7 nurses participate in my focus group, and this allowed me to increase my knowledge and confidence and skills in facilitating a focus group, some of the skills of transcribing and coding and creating themes of the data, and you know, it certainly ignited conversation within the group, and I think helpful conversation. So I wanted to know what their perceptions were of the barriers and facilitators to using these scales in practice, and was anyone in the team hitting the mark, doing it, and maybe not ever really talking about it? And then if so, what was different about their practice? And I wanted to know, getting to that intervention part, what did they think would help them use these scales more so as they're intended to be used in their practice? And so again, I'll go through the barriers. Training, not surprising, was the most commonly cited barrier. Everyone agreed. It's difficult. But training alone, it is important, but it's not sufficient to change practice. Changing practice is not a linear process, rather, or the result of the best evidence. So the strength of the evidence itself isn't enough to change our practice. And each knowledge use environment presents environmental, organizational, professional, and different variables that impacts practice change. So this is very similar to the scan. It's just a very intense experience, and might have tainted their view of using the tools in their practice. Okay, accepting, really buying into these scales being valuable in their practice was another barrier, and a big one too. Although the scales are increasingly being used over time, and despite that some nurses are agreeing that they do believe the scales will do what they're supposed to do and indicate the quality of the caregiver-infant relation or interaction, there still seems to be contradictions that came out in the focus group that suggested otherwise. Considering the purpose of the program is to help children get a healthy start in life by supporting healthy child development and attachment, Many nurses questioned whether the scales could actually help families, and some did not understand that the quality of early relationships measured by parent-child interaction scales are precursors to the development of attachment. And then some nurses felt they could already assess attachment without the need to use these scales. Communication with role clarity. So this theme captures a few different barriers to using NCAST in practice, including the uncertainty of how and when NCAST scales should be completed within the program, home visiting program. Some ambiguity between the role of the nurse and the role of the parent support worker, and how to communicate with each other to provide the service to the family, and the nurse's role in honoring person and family-centered care values while bringing their professional knowledge and judgment in the decision-making about family service plan goals that ultimately meet the goal of the family, healthy child development. So you'll see here there was some conflicting information that really will come out in strategies moving forward, so that we're going to clarify things, when to do the screen, when the interventions can be applied, who in terms of nurse and parent support worker, who does what and when, and how to communicate that to each other. Some parent support workers were doing interventions with families before an assessment was ever done, and so we know that that's not the part of the nursing process whatsoever. So there's some work to do, and we have a plan for that. The use of the scales in high-risk home settings was another theme that came out. As you know, like I mentioned with the scan, the nature of working with this vulnerable population makes the timing of visits and the best made plans not always able to happen. So this is an area we're going to work on too. And in the focus group, it was neat to see and I think important to hear what their thoughts were on the role of the nurse and client-centered care, because in our organization we've done quite a bit of work to become a best practice spotlight organization to implement the person and family-centered care best practice guideline across the organization. And so there seemed to be, my perception was that there's a misunderstanding of what the person and family-centered care values really mean, and how that translate into our role with clients. Falk and Becker summarizes that despite in being in relation with clients, characterized by mutuality, active participation of clients, and shared power, there are times when the expertise of the nurse plays a critical role in coming to the best decision for the client. And this came out, this was highlighted in conversation in an interview with a master trainer in the scan. And she describes it very nicely here, and I'll just read you what she said. Families are often in crisis, but they still have to parent through the crisis. They have to feed their baby and take care of their baby. It's important that the PHN not get too caught up in the crisis that may be out of their control of fixing. I had a mom who was going through a breakup, and it was a domestic violence situation. She was angry and waiting for the custody of the child to be settled. That process was in the courts and can take years before it's settled. In the HBHC program, we don't have any control to help that process happen any faster. So instead, I acknowledge that it must be tiring to worry about it every moment, but we can focus our visits on something more enjoyable and even more important, enjoying your time with her baby. We can still talk about her frustrations, but the majority of our visits are about her relationship with her baby and being the best parent she can be. With NCAST, PCI Scales, and the work of the family home visitor, they are doing better, and she's focusing on her child, even though she's still angry about the whole situation. She's reading to her child at night and is buffering the stress of the breakup from her child. Okay. So in terms of facilitators, not surprising, again, having an NCAST master trainer in-house was one of the biggest facilitators for our nurses here. Shannon is our master trainer, and she seemed to be a big change for some of the nurses here. And I don't think because the training was all that different at that point. I think because she's here, she's easily accessible. She really understands the program and can really explain it in ways that brings out what's important and what's not. Organizational support, the nurses here really felt that this organization supported them to use the scales in their practice at their own speed. We don't have any process map guideline or policy at the moment, and the nurses didn't want a policy. They felt that they wanted to work towards a goal over time and with soft support from the manager. But overall, you know, we have a master trainer in-house that is supporting Shannon to spend more time outside of the usual NCAST scale training or refresher to really work on the application part, and that's above and beyond the annual 1 to 2 days. So that is definitely a facilitator. And then nurses in the groups have had some solutions they kind of came about on their own, and so the conversation in the focus group really was a time that they shared unknowingly to each other how they overcame something like bad timing. So they had a plan to feed or observe a feeding, got there, the baby was already fed and fallen asleep, or had woken up and a parent, mom or dad, was just decided to start playing with the baby, so they took the opportunity to observe a teaching observation. So some of those, the benefit of doing a focus group or having a conversation like that, I certainly didn't anticipate, and I would definitely recommend something like that. So I thought this was neat to give an overview of what the scan, the interviews really came out, what came out in the interviews and the focus group, because everyone that I talked to about this in the scan and the focus group, we didn't know who was really hitting the mark. I didn't have that piece of data to go along with this data, and I still don't, but everyone worried that they were doing the worst, that across the program, the implementation rates were probably the worst of all the health units. And so I think that there's an opportunity there to come together and talk at a program level, frontline staff level, and work towards improving implementation. So getting back to the framework, through the focus group, I was able to use some of their feedback and put together some strategies for the organization to move forward for 2017. And you'll see here, this is just some of the things. Certainly the report is more in depth and supporting evidence and rationales to why I suggested. So definitely setting goals and team benchmarking, I think, will be useful moving forward. I think individually in a nurse practitioner level, I think it's important to set our goals and make sure our goals are in line with how scales are supposed to be used. So instead of having using one per family, that's not how they're intended to be used. It's meant to be used over time with interventions as needed. And so I think we really have to ensure our goals align with how NCAST scales are meant to be used and within the expectations of the ministry as well. And using audit feedback is certainly a promising practice for improving practice change. And so we're going to use the data mart to move forward to provide periodic check-ins and feedback to the nurses and the program as to how we're meeting our goals and benchmarking. NCAST implementation, PCI scale implementation is already a standing agenda item at our meetings, and so just ensuring we purposely discuss it and use those opportunities for some education as needed will be important. And we actually have Nicole Letourneau joining us for our meeting in May by Skype to spend some time with us, talk to us about the science and her thoughts on the scales. I know that the Healthy Babies Directors meeting last year, May 17th of 2016, there was a lot of mention of that in my scan, that day seemed to be an aha moment for many who were able to be there. And so we've really tried to see if Nicole was interested and available, and she certainly is more happy to join us. So we're looking forward to that. We're definitely going to work on some guideline or process map, maybe a policy, although the nurses didn't want that. So that's our goal for 2017. Doing better with training on the interventions so that the nurses also know what the interventions are and then can kind of direct the PSWs to what interventions for which families based on the assessment results. And you'll see the others there identifying some champions to support Shannon, our master trainer, and some peer-to-peer support for those that are needing a bit additional support that way. And we're looking at piloting a community practice for frontline Healthy Babies nurses. I'm not sure at this point how that's going to look. I'm just looking into reading about what makes a successful community of practice because we want it to be successful, and so there's more information to come on that. Okay, so just some quick tips. I'll go through this quickly. These are just some suggestions. Start with finding an area that in your practice or program that there's room for improvement. You use data to show your gap. I would, of course, suggest a framework to organize your project and plan it and carry through to evaluation, of course, and if ethics approval is needed, which I did for my fellowship, then there's a tool Public Health Ontario has. And start by looking at the literature to find more about your topic area as part of your planning as well. So I wanted a quick thank you and certainly acknowledge and thank the RNAO and the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, the Grey Bruce Health Unit, the NCAST Master Trainer Community of Practice, my mentor team, and all the nurses who were a part of this project, because really without any of these, I wouldn't have been able to find so much out and learn so much. Okay.
Thank you, Amanda, for a great presentation. I'm sure this is very interesting to all of the public health nurses and those involved in the Healthy Babies program. And we have a few minutes left over, so a chance to ask Amanda any questions. Certainly your presentation in the focus groups that you ran, there's a lot of rich data that you got from colleagues in regards to barriers and facilitators. And I wondered, as you were doing your presentation, if for others on the webinar today, if any of those resonated, barriers like the training and the workload as a public health nurse and the workload for families too, and trying to fit this scale in the context of visiting and supporting families, and maybe the lack of confidence using the scale was something that might be resonating with others on the call. And then you identified some facilitators, like the importance of training and education, and especially having someone on site and how valuable that was. And then also the importance of management support and having that those key stakeholders. And then lastly, you talked about the importance of just keeping it on the agenda. So it wasn't just a project with a beginning, middle, and end date, but rather something that you continue to be working on as a public health unit. So wondering if there's anyone on the call for participants interested in sharing their experiences. Again, you can put that in the chat box. And in the interim, maybe Amanda, if you can let us know what are the next steps as far as this ACPF? So where do you go from here?
Sure. So for our own program here, with the work of Shannon, our master trainer, and the program, and using the staff too to be part of the next steps, we've developed a plan for 2017, looking at evaluating some of the changes. We're going to make some changes to the training. So what that means is an additional time that Shannon's able to bring the nurses together to, after becoming reliable, again, reliable, to talk about application and going through the subscales and really always checking in with staff together what they need. So that's one thing. It's really setting the plan for this year and next year, and we're really planning to implement many of the recommendations in my report, and some are on the way, so already happening and started to happen. But I wanted to make sure that it was brought out and recognized that work is being done and will continue to move forward, because this is really important, this implementing this tool, and not just because it's a foundational tool in the program and the ministry says we have to, that's something I did learn from this experience, is that, as difficult as these tools can be while we're learning to implement them, I think the sensitive and responsive nurturing relationships really is a foundation to early child development and health across the lifespan, and I really do think they're the tools we need to use with families. Now, that doesn't mean it's always easy, but it'll definitely be an ongoing project to just reassess how it's doing, implementation, and troubleshooting from there.
Thanks. And picking up on that then, how will you evaluate the impact of this and the implementation strategies that have been used?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I was hopeful during my fellowship that our data analyst was able to create a report through the data mart that all the health units use that collate the PCI scale observations into that data mart. So I was hoping that our data analyst was able to create this report that was going to tell us of the families eligible, how many had the scales, had an observation done, either teaching or feeding, to look at, okay, what is our implementation truly, what is it really like, and then that will provide the audit and feedback on moving forward that looks specifically at our program level. So that's still, from my understanding, being worked on. It's out of our capabilities here at our health unit level, but I think it's important, and that will provide the evaluation. And we're going to be evaluating the training to see if it meets the learner's needs and how it can be approved on an ongoing basis.
That sounds very important, given that training and education sounds like it's integral to the success of this program. Mm-hmm. And really looking at it in the context of real life situations, including, as you've identified, the high-risk families that often have complex social needs. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have just 1 minute left, and I'm not seeing any questions. You mentioned a report. Do you want to just share a little bit of what's in that report?
Yeah, so if anyone's interested in seeing my full report, my email information is there. Send me an email. So my report certainly shares all the data that came out in the scan and the focus group and the literature scan in more detail than I was able to provide in this presentation. And it also, I also comment on my experience, my fellowship experience, and next steps, limitations. But if anyone's considering a fellowship or wondering more about what a fellowship is and if it's something that they might be interested in, I hope my report you can glean some things from my report based on that as well. So, yeah.
Thanks, Amanda. And certainly when we send out the slides to participants, then they'll have your email contact if they're interested in receiving that report. And we thank you for sharing that with us. And I'll just end on just a few updates. We do have, if you're interested in ACPF, there's a webinar on May the 1st at RNAO on the rnao.ca/events page. You can find more information about that. And I just wanted to give two quick updates regarding guidelines focusing on women and children. So the perinatal depression guideline will be released in the upcoming weeks. We're just finishing some final touches, and then will be available as an electronic download. And then currently working on the breastfeeding best practice guideline. This is a revision that will focus on exclusivity and duration of breastfeeding, and we'll be looking for stakeholders as external reviewers of that guideline, and that is available on the RNAO.ca best practice guidelines webpage if you're interested in that. And again, we could send a link for that as well. And then lastly, again, these workshops or these webinars are part of our Best Practice Champions Network. We will have, again, for 2017-18 year, in-person Champions workshops, so watch for those. At this point, we are just finalizing the host sites and the organization. So hope to see some of you out when we run these workshop series again. Otherwise, for today, I thank everyone for attending. It's just after 1 o'clock. So our thanks again, Amanda, for your presentation and for sharing what you've learned through your ACPF. Always a pleasure to hear from nurses who are taking their knowledge and using it to increase the leadership in nursing. So thank you for that. And thanks everyone for attending today.